So this talk, the title's changed slightly. It's a bit less grandiose than the one that's in the program because it represents me taking it into the territory of affect theory, which is relatively new territory for me. So in that sense, it's very much a work in progress. So it's called now The Affective Ethics of Computer Games, Some Thoughts on Aesthetic Education and the Technologies of the Self. It's been an interesting thing to come up with these thoughts. I never figured myself for a Deleuzean, whatever that means, but I've been quite interested in Brian Masumi's thoughts, as I'll get to later on. So this paper starts from Schiller's premise that ethics requires an aesthetic dimension that concerns our sensibilities, as Daniel has already talked about today. Reason alone cannot bring about adherence to a moral code. It is the aesthetic dimension that enables individuals to cultivate the sensuous disposition that would manifest as actual practices. That is to say, the very possibility of enacting worthy ethical ideals depends upon cultivation of an aesthetic sensibility. For Schiller, what was required was for man to use his capacity through reason to transform the work of necessity into his free choice, and to elevate physical necessity into a moral one. This is what he termed an aesthetic education. This kind of aesthetics as sensibility formation arguably has implications for ethics that are irreducible to fascism, hedonism, or indiscriminateness. However, the domain of the aesthetic is also one that bears a certain relationship to power. Structures of power become gradually transmuted into structures of feeling. On this basis, if the pleasures or aesthetics/aestheses of gameplay shape our sensibilities, such that in our pursuit of them we become habituated to seeking certain kinds of experiences and muting others, then I propose that our attention should turn to the aesthetics of gameplay in order to evaluate the ethico-aesthetic values enshrined within computer games. That is to say, ethics and values are embedded in computer games in terms of the pleasures that they divulge and the practices that they inculcate and reinforce. We may term this their ethos, as distinct from any explicit discursive and representational content pertaining to the ethical. A larger issue than can be examined here concerns the way in which the representational gaming content is interwoven with or layered together with what can be called the non-representational experiences engendered by gaming as a process-driven activity. There's more on this in the paper if you're interested. For the present purposes, I do not presume to be able to tidily compartmentalise what may be called visceral and cultural meaning-making, according to Margaret Wetherell. We are constantly engaged in transmuting feelings and sensations into language, tying them down to linguistic coordinates, but we can also delay this process. I do, however, want to hold that it is fruitful to think about forces that are largely non-representational, that have various intensities, that move us towards particular subject positions, and that have not yet been anchored in representation. And whilst the connection between ethical content and the representational aspects of games have already been discussed in relation to the ways in which we comprehend procedural rhetoric and make moral choices, the full implications of a Schillerian aesthetic education have not received the same amount of attention, particularly in relation to affect theory. This is not, on my part, a commitment to a view of affects being autonomously non-representational that would deem any further attempt to engage with the work of sifting through the ways in which the representational is entangled with the non-representational. That would be a bit misconceived. So the kind of aesthetic education provided by computer games that interests me here goes beyond procedural rhetoric understood as making propositional claims. Bogost has defined procedural rhetoric as the practice of persuading through processes in general and computational processes in particular, a technique for making arguments with computational systems and for unpacking computational arguments others have created. Successfully persuading someone, however, still leaves a gap between their agreeing to do something and their actually doing it, the very gap that interested Schiller. Bogos seems to tether procedural rhetoric to propositional content that is as logical as a verbal argument. As you can see here, he says that the McDonald's video game makes claims about the business practices required to run a successful global fast food empire. These propositions are every bit as logical as verbal arguments. What seems to be missing from Bogos' accounts is a sense of the non-propositional, affective, rhythmic content within computer games and the pull that this exerts on us. With Pedicini's The McDonald's video game, for example, could the instances of players getting caught up in the enjoyment of playing the game and thus putting out of mind the intention of the game's structures to serve as a critique of the fast food industry be due to the following disjunction? That is, between, on the one hand, the procedural argument about the inevitability of corruption in the fast food industry, and on the other, the visceral, non-verbal argument conveyed by the pleasures of play. Essentially, whilst the procedural argument is clearly embedded into the game, it is perhaps overshadowed by the persuasive rationale of the play that it makes possible, a chain of pleasurable and compelling actions, a circuit of flow-like and engaging desire and affect. We can see Pedicini's procedural argument as being weakened by this disjunction, or as Pedicini having in fact made a second-order kind of claim based on this very disjunction about how making money in the fast food industry at any cost is as compelling as playing the game, leading to our cognitive efforts to resist it to fail. Sicart has written about the moral choices that we make in the course of gameplay. For him, it is only games that call for moral reasoning, like Carmageddon, that are interesting from an ethical perspective, because there's a choice of behaviour. By comparison, the rules of Tetris or Space Invaders do not afford any kind of ethical values that have to be enacted, interpreted, or experienced when playing the games. Moral reasoning takes place in the intertwining of the rules and the game world, in what he calls the space of possibility. This moral reasoning, being based on the game's rules, as with Bogos' procedural rhetoric, can be articulated and cognitively understood, and is not a matter of non-representational intensities. The choice in Carmageddon is, as he puts it, between behaviour that is violent and behaviour that is non-violent. However, there's much more complexity to this account that I can't really go into now. For example, the player has to feel an affinity with the game world in order for the game to be morally relevant. So my contention here is that the role that the aesthetics of the game have in fomenting certain kinds of gamer habitus and affective styles has an ethical significance which has received comparatively less attention. The transformation of the player at stake is not that which is effected by comprehending a procedural rhetoric and drawing a set of propositional conclusions from it, nor is it arriving at a new kind of moral reasoning. It pertains to a transformation of the player's ethos or disposition and an attempt to situate this change in relation to the present operation of power. Kirkpatrick has proposed that the structure of feeling that defines video game aesthetics has been overlooked in game studies. The form of the game, he argued, is revealed when the player finds the rhythmic associations necessary to reveal its possibilities, and it is a property of both the composition and of the viewer. He states that it is only possible to have a feeling of accomplishment playing the McDonald's video game because the meaning or symbolic level has been banished. This feeling is then undermined when we reflect on what we have done. He says that what is political about video games is not to be found at the level of the kinds of messages that they communicate, but rather in the fact that even the political ones actually eschew politics in favour of form. Many theorists have attempted to delve into the extent in which the non-representational structures of feeling can be and have been harnessed by power. Many of these theorists can be situated in the so-called turn to affect in the last decade. Masumi has argued for a separation between the quality of an experience and its intensity. The former picks out conventional discursive and linguistic framing, whilst the latter is the unprocessed, chaotic state of bodily happening, which is a division that, for him, accounts for the separation between discourse and the body. Thrift's interest is in practices that he sees as operating below the threshold of cognition, and Connolly has explored the possibility that messages flowing between multiple brain regions are too small and fast to be identified by consciousness, but are nonetheless amenable to some degree of cultural inscription, experimental research, and technical intervention. In the domain of writing on video games, Schinkel has stressed that ideologies are not only inscribed discursively, they are also incorporated by the body as gestural and physical behaviours. And the current that runs through Ash's work on video games has been on how power operates on the non-representational level of objects, forces, and capacities to shape how bodies think and act, how it works on a series of embodied habitual levels that do not necessarily straightforwardly or only relate to the representational content of the object in interface environments. Ash suggests that video games do not simply dull or normalize forms of habitual action or skill. Rather, they also encourage creative forms of habitual modulation on the part of consumers. In fact, Ash claims that many gameplay and software objects sensitize players' bodies to develop what Stiegler terms new forms of creative anticipation. However, he does also believe that although Final Fantasy, Resident Evil, and Metal Gear are very different genres of games, what connects their changes in design philosophy is the way in which they attempt to generate envelopes with increasingly high levels of homeomorphic dynamism organised around smaller and more micro-differentiated now points. For him, this was a risk-reducing strategy on the part of the developers. The ability to capture and hold players' attention is being formalised across game genres so as to offset the risks involved in big-budget games. This does seem then to go past the way towards what can reasonably be described as a non-representational form of normalization. Players may be developing new forms of creative anticipation within the constraints that make them more likely to accede to a particular view of the world and its distribution of the sensible. Thus, insofar as there is a connection between the aesthetics of the game, understood as its non-representational affective qualities on the one hand, and a particular economic rationality that is entrenched with a political rationality, ideology, or distribution of the sensible on the other, i.e. an isomorphism between the two, then the ethics embedded in the game can be said to be those aligned with that regime of power. I want to turn now quickly to a strand of critique of affect theory, which centres on the idea that the model of subjectivity being drawn upon by the philosophers of affect is too simplistic. Some conceptions of subjectivity seem to relegate the subject to a reactive ensemble of parts and to be uninterested in furnishing it as a site of psychological depth that can refract the affective forces that pass through it. Wetherall has argued that for Thrift, people are like lurching semi-animated crash dummies. Subjectivity becomes a non-place or waiting room, through which affects, as autonomous lines of force, pass on their way to somewhere else. See also Williams and Protevi. The question is how to think subjectivity as a site of transformation marked by certain possibilities, propensities, resistances, and so on, that are unique to itself as a zone that contests, morphs, and refracts the affective forces that pass into it. It's worth noting that this critique has a parallel with the topic of pleasure in media studies, which has seen a move towards being more fine-grained and being based on the socio-economic coordinates of the subject in question. Garnham has criticised Fiske's use of jouissance as existing beyond ideology and culture, holding that it is important to uncover how the pleasure one finds in media consumption is shaped by social, cultural, and economic factors, as well as by the media content itself. Also, Thornham has criticised the universality of flow as failing to address the socio-cultural issues concerning which individuals play which games, where, and for how long. Further, gaming failure, which is by default aligned with so-called negative affects that discipline the player to make the correct choices, can itself be pleasurable or contribute to deferred pleasure. So essentially, players' different frameworks of meaning-making can conflict with something like the positive affect of the immediate in-game reward. Essentially, the turn to affective gaming pleasures as having ideological force can place a heavy burden on game design as the vector for that force, which arguably skews it towards both a model of subjectivity that does away with the subject and, related to this, a technologically deterministic bent that is light on considerations of relationality. On the other hand, it can be useful sometimes to try to uncover general tendencies. Sermon has remarked that as one becomes a more sophisticated gamer, other pleasure registers come into play, which are concerned with a gaming literacy of sorts, in which one becomes sensitive and connoisseurial towards the conventions of games. If playing games builds gaming literacy over time, then there may be a parallel shift in the kinds of gaming affects/pleasures that players seek, and aesthetic education being played out that is worthy of investigation. In order to get round this critique from subjectivity, which complicates the task of straightforwardly gauging the affective ethics of game, I'll focus on a different approach, one that foregrounds the dynamics of computer games, appropriation by players, or the co-construction of users and technologies. There's a critical shift in register here from thinking the ethics attached to the aesthetics of a computer game in and of itself, to the ethics that is tied to the ways in which we allow those aesthetics to transform us, to move us into developing habitual actions, or ethoi. It asks, how do we appropriate the affective or aesthetic forces of computer games in the fashioning of our subjectivities? How can this be otherwise, and how do we do so in a non-cognitive or quasi-cognitive manner? I turn here to Foucault's practices of the self. Foucault constructs the self as an object of a complex and difficult elaboration. Technologies of the self are the means through which individuals effect a certain number of operations on their own bodies and souls, thoughts, conducts, and ways of being. The work on the self was a poiesis, productive work involving deliberate fabrication, in which the subject employs technique, craft, or art. It is a modulation of the self, albeit according to a telos that is not defined in advance. It can be seen as a ceaseless play or engagement with power, folding it, submitting to it, developing more complex relations to it, increasing one's remoteness from it, a Deleuzian folding of force. Considering this aesthetics of the self then paves the way for us to fully comprehend Masumi's concept of developing an affectivity in the next section, which I read through a Foucauldian lens. Essentially, I see it as a poiesis by means of which we can challenge that which is on the boundaries of consciousness. Masumi thinks that there are relational techniques that can be practiced to modulate unfolding events, and which have the potential of reorientating tendencies towards different ends without designating exactly what they are. In other words, the response to non-conscious affective manipulation is to develop one's affective sense or attunement that are thoughts felt into action as an open-ended counter to it. This is Masumi. This thinking feeling of affect in all its immediacy can be strategic. Since it modulates an unfolding event on the fly, it cannot completely control the outcome, but it can inflect it, tweak it, it can amplify, resonate, or even bifurcate, potentially in ways that don't coagulate into a power structure, but instead keep restructuring, keep the structuring alive. This is not a rationality, it's an affectivity redolent with thought, flush with action. End quote. This affectivity, considered as a techne, art, or skill, is like other skills honed not only via embodied training through non-conscious bodily acts. The entire process of skill acquisition is also reflected upon at selected intervals and with a frequency that likely depends on the intentness with which the skill is being learned. Indeed, the capacity to consciously do this is under-examined in the literature on habitus. We are able to bring to consciousness, through sustained attention, anything that we want to rework, bad playing habits, for example. However, it can also be said that the ways in which we are able to rework the form of the self are not always actions that we can articulate to ourselves through a bringing to consciousness. Masumi's notion of thinking-feeling being strategic can be seen as directing us to the aim of problematizing the culture of sensory experience into which we are being pushed by finding ways of experiencing differently, pragmatically switching the register of experience in ways that cannot necessarily be articulated. However, just because this is not what he calls a rationality, he does not sever the connection between feeling and thinking. How then might these ideas pertaining to Masumi's affectivity as a technology of the self inform our countergaming practices? Well, we might begin with some self-recognition pertaining to one's own specificity of the affective currents that one is more likely to be swept up with or to be indifferent to, and to then experiment with different modes of modulating them, giving into them, redirecting them, or resisting them. This might take the form, for example, that one does not allow oneself to slip into a default mode of transgressive play, such as glitch hunting, because to do so, given one's knowledge of one's existing disposition, would take up all of one's time with the game and preclude one from developing an evolving and changing style or affectivity, a non-codifiable means of responding to the game that is also strategic. It doesn't necessarily entail just distancing oneself from playing the game as one would otherwise want to play it, but in mindfully modulating the sensory feedback loop that one has with the game, probing for possibilities of restructuring, defying coagulation, and switching the register of experience. And it isn't just about trying one thing and then another, but may involve experimenting with the intensity entailed by persistence. So if it can be said that we lack the critical tools with which to deduce the ethics, understood as the principle or ethos governing action, concomitant with an aesthetics, understood as an affective force, then we have already explored the idea that such critical tools need not consist in the ability to theorize as they do take the form of pragmatic manifestation in an affectivity. That is, to pragmatically respond to forms of affective manipulation through an affective work on the self. On this analysis, the aesthetic education at stake in this paper as an ethical problem is no longer the Schillerian task of figuring out how to make a particular ethical or political framework more inhabitable. Instead, an aesthetic education consists in encouraging the process of developing an affectivity that opens one up to transformation that leads to improvised self-modulation, resulting in counter-amplifications and counter-crystallizations. Thank you.
Extremely quick. Can you put your first bibliography slide back, please?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Oh, that was just a practical question.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Maybe you're raising your fingers and I'm not wearing my glasses. Okay then.
Oh, no.
Go ahead, please.
I can write.
I can also ask my
Okay. So, my question will be very, very brief because you spoke a little bit on relational aesthetics. Yeah, the concept that I automatically associate with Rancier's notion of this micro-political events that actually can possess the power to change something in our ethical / political everyday being. So my question would be, how do you reconcile it with what you said and summing up your project? Does it relate in any way, or did I just picked the one phrase that my melting brain associated with this famous French philosopher?
Did you say relational aesthetics?
Yeah.
I don't think I said that.
Really?
In that term.
Okay, so
but,
that may be
I
my melting brain, don't worry. So yeah.
No, but I can try and answer.
But maybe, okay, so let me reframe this question. So how would you, okay, maybe a very simple question. Do you understand, this micro-politics actions as something that will work, I don't know, to the detriment of the kind of this mutual understanding that will eventually lead to this, aesthetic education, performed, in group and having this positive outcome? Does micropolitics work, in detriment to your project?
I think it's too preliminary to be called my project at the moment. But, this point here, which I didn't really talk about, is a quite standard critique of so-called Deleuzian lines of flight, which is based on rather romantic idea of this kind of escapism, these flashes of negation in the pan. That's all they are. They can't ever solidify into anything else, into a kind of habitus, because the Deleuzians fear that it will be just subsumed again under power structures. Rancière's take is much more different. His work is based on equality and kind of foundations of humanism and so on. But there's other people who are thinking about this. Catherine Malabou's work on plasticity, maybe one potential response to the kind of Deleuzian fault. But I think it's an interesting question in terms of, do we start from, in terms of any political project, from a collectivity or from the individuals, and from the individuals have it be something that then accumulates momentum. And that seems to be, in some ways, less forced. So it's perhaps about the bridging of the gap between the extreme of that kind of Deleuzian line of flight into something which then has the potential to develop into a habitus that is transmitted in a non-coercive way, and for that to be the means by which something is spread. And that's something I've just started thinking about. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for an interesting talk. Did I understand you correctly to say that you thought that affect was non-representational, and affect response was not representational?
That is the difficult question, because it is about the issue about whether or how the non-representational is entangled with the representational, and how that occurs in terms of our sense making, or what we do with our kind of sensory experience. And I've gone through various different commentators who have kind of different positions on this matter. So Margaret Weatherall is very critical of people like Brian Masumi and Nigel Thrift, who hold more onto the kind of sheer non-representationality of affect as being these kind of autonomous forces. So some of the critiques that, in terms of subjectivity, that I ran through would be, applicable to their work. But then again, on the other hand, Weatherall is herself, I think, not always clear as to what the position or territory of affect is, if it's subsidiary to, say, representational meaning making and discourse and so on. So I think there's a kind of interesting terrain where different people give different weightings or priorities to kind of the representational and the non-representational in order to solve particular problems that they're dealing with, and it can be something that's useful in certain situations, depending on that weighting. I myself haven't fully worked through my personal position on this. I'm just kind of reading through different works.
Okay, I'm afraid time is up. Sorry, we have to stay in the time frame.
Thank you.
Probably have to continue the questions and answers afterwards. So thanks.